well, after this now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Centre of Educational Neuroscience seminar. Before I'll introduce our speaker of today, we'll just give it a few more minutes for other people to join. John, I don't know whether you got your camera on because I can't see you anymore.
He has, Joe. It's on.
Oh, that's bizarre. Must be something wrong with my screen then. Oh, there you go. Now I can see you, John. I don't know what happened there. Okay, I think we'll give it a slow start. So welcome everybody again at the Centre of Educational Neuroscience seminar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, John Bishop. John is a pioneer and a qualified teacher and school governor responsible for delivering innovative educational programs in a lot of schools in the UK, so over 1,000 primary schools, I think. He's the founder and former managing director of Evolve, a multi-award-winning social enterprise, and he was instrumental in developing new educational workforce called Health Mentors that address multiple challenges currently facing our next generation. He's currently the managing director for Evolve Education. And Evolve Education, I don't know whether, John, you're going to tell us a little bit more about Evolve Education already, so I won't say too much because it will come back, but you're doing a lot around training and coaching programs to transform human potential into performance in the workplace. Today, John is here to talk a little bit more about detail matters, you know, why delivering successful school-based research projects is so difficult. And I very much look forward to hearing more about it, John. So thank you very much. Sorry, as usual, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and then afterwards you can also ask your questions straight to John. So over to you, John. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jo, and thanks to everybody for joining. So the next 60 minutes, hopefully I'll be able to get through all of the 4 points on the slide here. Now, I haven't given myself a strict timetable to stick to, and the reason for that is I've not delivered this presentation before, and I'm unlikely to do so again. So it's very much a collector's item, this. We could have 50 minutes of conversation, or it could be 5 minutes, so we'll just have to wait and see how we get on. Now, this is the webinar detail as it was billed, and I guess a lot of the focus on evidence within education now is a result of the EEF. And recently we've had the National Tutoring Programme, which has received a lot of investment on the back of its evidence base. And I think the current conversation is around summer schools as well as part of the return to school agenda. But what I'm trying to say here in this second paragraph is that there are a lot of variables that you can't control when you're working with schools. So try to control those that you can. And this is a short presentation on some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. And I wanted to just pick out a couple of key phrases here. The first one is around high quality research. Now, as providers, you're opening yourselves up for external scrutiny. So whenever we've done independent research, we sign over all intellectual property so that if it's not as we'd hoped, as the results don't go according to plan, that could ultimately put us out of business as a small organisation. And I'll talk more about our organisation as the presentation unfolds. But equally, high quality research is something that any researchers on the webinar here and institutions be really interested in, because your name is marked forever on that research paper, which will be accessible through various repositories and search engines. So it's in both interests, both the provider, whether that's an organisation like ours, an educational provider for schools, or schools themselves. It's important that the quality is the highest, the research is the highest possible quality. So that's the first point. And the second point here is a cautionary tale. I've worked in schools now for a number of years, and we had a pretty high profile research project which didn't go according to plan. And I'm just trying to emphasize some of the reasons why I feel the project could have been improved. And even with all of my experience in this sector, there's still things that I'm learning along the way, and I learned a lot as a result of this project. So first of all, I'm not a scientist. It's important clarification to make here at the start. But I'm a problem solver, and I look forward to implementing some of the solutions to this one particular problem about how to conduct an effective research project. And I'm hoping to introduce some of these lessons that I'm sharing with you myself. And this is why I was keen to put this presentation on today when I was invited to speak, because this process has helped me to clarify some of my own thoughts. Now, I'm not a researcher, but I do love research. So I've read a lot of research papers, and I continue to do so. I'm not a talker, but I felt it was important to share some of these experiences with you, because the organisation who we worked with on the evaluation that I'll be talking about in a little bit more detail, they're also very experienced in this space, but we both learned a lot of lessons along the way, and hopefully I can share some of those with you today. So 25 years experience working with schools, mainly in the primary sector. I do have QTLS status, but I've never been a formal teacher in a school environment. I'm currently the Managing Director of Evolve Education. We're a training provider, and we have apprenticeship status on the ESFA's portal, which means that we can receive funds directly from the government to deliver apprenticeship training. But we're also supporting other colleges, universities with their training as well, and also with their wellbeing and pastoral support of learners. That's a little bit about the organisation I'm currently leading, but this webinar is focused on our social enterprise, which is an organisation I used to lead a few years ago. And the second half of the webinar billing here refers to this cautionary tale again. And hopefully, I'll be fairly optimistic in my tone. It's not all doom and gloom. We want to learn from our mistakes, but it's really useful if you can learn from other people's mistakes instead. So hopefully, you won't make the same mistakes that we made when we embarked on this research project 2 years ago. So we'll be focusing on what could go wrong and some of the factors that you may not have considered before, but I'm sure that some of these points that I'll be covering aren't new to you, but it's certainly worth reinforcing them and maybe coming at it from a slightly different perspective as well. So this is the organisation I referred to, the social enterprise Evolve, a social impact company. You can see Sean here, one of our former health mentors, working with a student. And Evolve, just a brief background, initially in the early days of its formation as an organisation, it focused on using sport as a vehicle for personal development. And it was feedback from school teachers who told us about the impact that our mentors were having when they volunteered in the classroom. Mentors like Sean here, not qualified as teachers, but they were really developing important and meaningful relationships with the most vulnerable and hard to reach children. And that's when the project was really conceived, called Project Hero. It's called Health Engagement Real Outcomes. And we typically work with the most challenging 10% of pupils in a school. Very often it's for behavioural reasons, but often it's because they're just not making the academic progress that they should be making. And we work with students across the whole year. So Sean here, he could be working with a cohort of typically between 20 and 30 students in a school. This is Project Hero and the role of the health mentor. And as Joe mentioned earlier, we've pioneered this work within the compulsory education sector. But health mentors are now becoming established within the NHS as part of the apprenticeship agenda there. And we also have corporate organisations and elite sports clubs as well interested in the model for different reasons. If you think about the health mentor and what they do, they bring the best elements of a teaching assistant, personal trainer, learning mentor, even a life coach to a certain extent, and that's the focus of their work in schools. The project itself, it's been recognised on a number of occasions now in terms of business, social enterprise, evidence-based practice, healthy lifestyles, mentoring. We've won various awards along the way. But most people would say, although we've been a critical success, we're not a box office smash yet, partly because the funding situation in compulsory education, but also, I would say, because we don't yet have a rock solid evidence base for this work. But we have been heavily involved in research ever since the organisation was formed. Back in 2015, Leeds Beckett University, and they conducted a small-scale trial of our work in 6 schools in Keighley, and they identified the active ingredients that were necessary to deliver the effect sizes that we're showing. And this was on an individual basis. So what was the health mentor doing that led to the engagement in learning that the head teachers were noticing? And self-regulation was a key feature that came through from the research. And that's something that we've built on and we're continuing to build on now, and it feeds into the study that I'll be talking about in a little bit more detail. A couple of years later, LKM-CO, now known as Centre for Education and Youth, they conducted a slightly larger scale study, involved all of our schools, it was about 70 at the time, and it looked at the data from our evaluation tool, which is called the Wellbeing Compass. And they were looking at this more from an organisational perspective rather than an individual mentor's perspective. And they identified 3 agents or 3 active ingredients that led to the greatest improvements in pupil outcomes. And those 3 ingredients were duration, intensity, and variety of the intervention. So in terms of duration, many head teachers would want our mentors to work with lots of different children throughout the school year. So they would assign us to students for maybe a month or a half term. But what we found is that the mentors are having a much greater effect on students that they work with across the whole 39 weeks. So duration matters. Intensity also matters. So how many times do we see those children on a typical week? Where we're in a school for 1 day a week, it doesn't have the same effect size as somebody who's working in the school for 5 days a week. I know budget implications are important there, but that was a key finding. And variety as well. So not just seeing students in a typical mentoring session, but maybe seeing them on the playground at lunchtime, working with them in the classroom, seeing them in various different contexts. That was important. So we're not new to research, and what we wanted to do was take our research to the next level, which is where Healthy Brains comes in, which is the research that we're going to unpack in a little bit more detail now. So why Healthy Brains? Linked to the earlier work research from Leeds Beckett University, where they identified self-efficacy and concepts like learned helplessness and growth mindset, Carol Dweck. This was what we were trying to do with children, but we weren't quite understanding the mechanisms that underpinned that work. And that led us to some of our own research around neuroplasticity and the work of Professor Merznick. And fortunately for us, we through a chance encounter, we've developed a relationship that's still ongoing with Michael and his team. And for those that don't know, Michael is regarded by many as the founding father of neuroplasticity. He co-invented the cochlear ear implant. And you can see the logo there. Brain HQ is one of his previous projects. It's an app. It's probably the most, it's a digital cognitive training tool, smartphone app or on a web platform, we've got over 250 randomized control trials demonstrating its efficacy in a whole range of different outcomes. And we were keen to use this with children in school environments, and that's where Stronger Brains comes in. And unfortunately, that evidence base doesn't exist anywhere else, only on a very small scale basis in individual schools. So we had an opportunity to introduce Brain HQ to all of the schools that we were working with, but we wanted to start with a small scale trial. So that was the basis of the project, and we had a local authority that was really interested in working with us on this. That's, sorry for the abbreviation there, the LA engagement is a local authority that wanted to work with us. And because it was a local authority, they kept talking about randomized control trials. That's the level of research that they wanted before they could really get behind us. But it was frustrating for us as a small organisation because we don't have the funds or the financial resource to really get behind something like that. So it was another chance encounter with somebody quite senior at the Health Foundation, and we were talking to her about a different aspect of her work, of our work, but it was when we got onto the subject of neuroplasticity, it really captured her attention, and she said, look, what can I do to help? And we talked about healthy brains, and she said, yeah, that's something I'll support. So that's the reason why we're able to make progress with this particular project. And now this is the end result of that. So this was published August 27, 2020, but actually related to academic school year 2018-19. And you can see that Symmetrica Jacobs were our evaluation partner. And the study itself involved over 1,200 students across 10 schools. So it wasn't all of the schools that we're working with. 10 schools, but 2 of these were our control schools. I'm not going to go into all of the detail behind this, but I'm going to pick out a couple of key points on the next slide, and then we'll get into the lessons learned. So the study itself was based on our internal evaluation tool called the Wellbeing Compass. 25 questions across 5 different domains of well-being, so things like nutrition, physical activity, mental health, cognitive fitness, and that survey is conducted 4 times a year. At the start of the year in September, at the end of this autumn term, then at the end of the spring term, the end of the summer term. So we have 4 data points in total. Now we have done this study before, a study on that basis before with LK & Co. But what we added to the mix this time is we also added Brain HQ, and we used it as an addition to our assessment. So we used it to assess the brain health of students we're working with, and we checked the correlation between the results that came back from Brain HQ and the self-assessment questionnaire that was shared with students as well. And we also wanted to assess the impact of the Brain HQ training tool. So this is where children use the smartphone app or log onto a website, and they complete a training program where we try and get to 30 hours of screen time. And that's the key threshold, which has been shown on a number of occasions to trigger the neurological improvements that lead to other outcomes. That was what our intentions were at the start of the program. And for anyone who is expecting lots of slides like this with graphs and charts, you'll be slightly disappointed because I've only got 2, this one and another one, and I'm not going to go into all of the detail here. If you can see the detail there on the screen. But I did just want to highlight a couple of things that the report did find. So first of all, it reinforced earlier learning from LK & Co. and the Leeds-Beckett report. And what that means is that health mentors have a significant impact on children's wellbeing. So that was not new, but it was nice to reinforce that message. But what it also showed is that there's a spillover effect. So the schoolmate section on the bottom left-hand side there, that showed that the children who weren't on the program, who weren't part of Project Hero, their wellbeing also improved as a result of the intervention. And that was something that we hadn't seen before in any of our previous studies. And it's also worth noting, actually, that in the previous work, there was an absence of control. So we didn't have control schools. We were only comparing the impact of the intervention on children we were working with with their peers in that same school. So this report did add an important control element where we matched the 8 active schools with 2 schools that similar demographics, but they didn't have a health mentor working in them. So we did add that extra dimension to this. And the final thing just to add before I move on to the next slide is that the engine room in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, this is a small school in Haringey in Tottenham, and as well as Project Hero, they also took another intervention from Evolve, which was to work with really challenging pupil in terms of their behaviour, where they worked with us for all week in the mornings for 3 hours a day, and we did a whole range of different therapeutic interventions, but they were able to conduct the Brain HQ training schedule as planned. That was the engine room participants. Now, this was probably the most pleasing graph or chart in the report, because it shows how children who have got a relatively lower starting point in terms of their well-being can catch up with their peers by the end of the academic year. And it doesn't happen in a straight line as this chart suggests it does. Most of the improvements actually happen in term 3, which supports previous research. But it shows that children who do get the benefit of an intensive wellbeing program can catch up with their peers within 39 weeks. And it was an 8 percentage point improvement here that we managed to achieve over the period of that 12 months. That's particularly relevant for the current situation we've got, where there's lots of children now who have fallen behind because of different home lives and different circumstances at home with remote learning. So this is something which I know Evolve as an organisation is really promoting and benefiting from the interest that it's generated. So this project here, it wasn't the total failure that I may have indicated at the beginning. It did show a number of key elements that have helped the organisation to grow and develop. But other than the fleeting mention of Brain HQ within the engine room, we didn't really get to use the cognitive training tool to its full potential. And there are a number of different reasons for that, but we failed in our initial intention, which was to rigorously assess the impact that it could have within the British school system. What we did find is that Brain HQ assessment, it does correlate with our self-assessed questions regarding cognitive function. And we also did manage to show that the brain health, as measured through Brain HQ, of children that participate in the program improved over the 12 months. So we were able to show certain elements that we're hoping to achieve, but what we weren't able to do was implement the Brain HQ training protocol that was part of the research design. Now, what happened? Why didn't that work as intended? And hopefully these next 4 or 5 slides will get to the bottom of that and start unpicking some of the lessons that we've learned from that we're hoping to put right in our next study. So, before we start, I mentioned Symmetrica were our evaluation partner, and they're a great organisation to work with. They are equally as disappointed as we are with the outcomes of the project. We both learnt lots of lessons throughout the project, and I've sat down with them on a number of occasions now, and all of the lessons that I'm sharing with you here today, we've discussed and I've shared with Symmetrica as well. Now, I think this first lesson is about the number of different people that will be involved in school-based research projects. Now, in this case, there's an extra dynamic here because Evolve is a provider of support services to a school. So there's an extra link in the chain. But when you're working in a school, there are lots of different people who have all got decision-making responsibilities. And even with the school head teacher, who often thinks they're the king or queen of their own castle, they're responsible to a multi-academy trust or a local authority. And we had a number of occasions where head teachers had signed off a document to say, yes, we want to proceed with this trial as planned, but then governors got involved and they overruled them. So there's a lot of interpersonal dynamics at play that need to be front of mind when you're developing the research protocol. And it's also important that that research protocol is regularly reviewed. So in specific relation to our project, what was the issue with Brain HQ training? So you would think there might have been some GDPR considerations or ethical considerations with it being a health intervention as well as an educational one, but that wasn't the obstacle that we encountered. The main challenge was head teachers allowing students out of their English and maths lessons to work with us and our mentors for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 12 weeks. That was what we asked of them. When you do the maths on that, that adds up to 30 hours of contact time where we wanted to get them on the Brain HQ app, completing their cognitive training program. Head teachers agreed in principle, but when it came to the delivery of the project, a number of them reneged. And it was only when there was some pushback from some of their class teachers and some of their middle leaders in the school, when the head teacher realised that they'd signed up to something they couldn't see through. Now, this is a real challenge for us because we had to mobilise other schools at very short notice to make sure that we could hit the pupil numbers that we're hoping for. We also had to deal with a change of leadership in a number of schools. And I know that this is often the case as part of the academisation agenda when a new multi-academy trust is formed and a school forms part of that trust. Very often the head teacher or the principal who's in situ, one of the first things that happens is they get replaced. And with the 10 schools that we had lined up for this project, 3 of them all experienced that within the space of 6 months. So again, we had to recruit new schools to replace them or go back into the existing schools and resell the proposition to the new leadership. There was also changes in leadership within our own organisation. At the start of the project, I was the managing director, but halfway through my role changed and the new managing director came on board within our organisation, and that caused problems. We were really passionate about this project, and it was the key focus. It was our #1 priority at the time. But since we received funding or notification of funding from the Health Foundation and the project starting, lots of other things changed from our perspective. So there's also internal dynamics at play here, as well as the external dynamics in the school, which are very difficult to control for. Lesson 2 is, it does link to the previous point, and it's about being skeptical. So I was the main point of contact in the early days of the project, and I was never challenged or any of my confirmations were ever, there was never any scrutiny, or there was never any assurances needed. It was all done on faith, which is fine. I guess I must be a trustworthy character, but if I was running an evaluation organisation or conducting research and I'm putting my name to it, I would want to make 100% certain that all of those assurances are rock solid. And when it comes to a project like this, there are various different ways that could be achieved. So for example, we asked schools to sign off, and we gave them a research protocol. This is the requirement. This is what we're looking for. Are you happy to proceed? Every school signed that document. Now, it's not legally binding, and we never end up taking a school to court if they renege, but it's just something which confirms their commitment to the project. And it would have been a real, I guess it wouldn't have taken me much time at all if I was asked to share those assurances with the evaluation partner, just to make sure that everything is in place. But there were some things which weren't in place that should have been. And we were asked certain questions, and I said, yes, that's something we'll get around to doing, but maybe we didn't quite get there. And some of those things include all of our local managers being fully recruited and on board with the program. Now, that's important because those 10 schools that were participating were in 3 different geographical regions, so they had 3 different managers involved. And I was asked the question about how on board those managers were with the program. And unfortunately, they weren't as close to it as they could have been. Now, as a result of that, I gave assurances that probably weren't as confirmed as they should have been. So if you're conducting research in a school, whether it's directly with a school or whether it's through a third-party organisation like Evolve, it's really important that you check everything, be sceptical, because you're putting your name to that research paper. So you want to make sure that there's nothing that could go wrong. You don't want to leave anything to chance. Now, this probably sounds, I'm only at lesson 2 and we've got 4 to go, and it may sound like there's a lot more work involved on top of the schedule that's already pretty heavy as a researcher. But I don't think any of these jobs on their own are very complex. And one of the later lessons is about project management and relationship management. But it's just being aware of these things, aware of what could go wrong, because it's a real shame if all of your hard work that you put into these research projects doesn't produce the high quality research that you're hoping for. Because more often than not, it's these tripwires, these small things that will get in the way of a really successful project. It won't be to do with the quality of the statistical analysis or the amount of time you spend on the data analysis. It'll be something simple as just checking an agreement's been signed. And certainly from our perspective, that external challenge and scrutiny would have been welcomed. It would have kept us on our toes a little bit better. Lesson 3, understand the challenge. Now, some of you who are listening here may have worked with schools before, not encountered any of these issues, or you may have worked with larger providers, the Goliaths out there, let's say Pearson Education, who've got the resources to dedicate to projects like this. And the previous 2 lessons are just not relevant in that situation. But David, he shows us where innovation happens, and high quality research could help smaller organisations like Evolve cross the chasm and make a real difference in society. And we need your help to do that. And we know what we know, but we don't always know what you know. So this is where that collaborative partnership working is really important. So organisations like Evolve are never short on ideas or innovation, passion, enthusiasm. It just needs channeling. And I think there's a question here about who you want to work with. Now, this goes both ways. So it may be nice for a small organisation like Evolve to work with a large, well-respected evaluation organisation like Symmetrica, who normally work with the government or government departments. But there was a slight mismatch there in terms of what they expected to put into the project and what we expected to get from them as part of the project. So you need to think about this, I believe, when you're in the early stage and trying to work out if there are opportunities there that are worth going for. Because it may be that it fits in your portfolio or it's of particular interest to you on an individual basis, but you may not have the time, bandwidth, capacity, energy to give the smaller organisations the extra care and attention that the project will need. So I do think that there's some matchmaking that's really important here, and understanding the challenge that's involved. Not always in the implementation stage once the project starts, but in the project planning stage early on. That's where a lot more work needs to go into smaller organisations than the bigger Goliaths out there that have probably gone through the process 100 times before. Now, this is a key question for all research projects, really. What's the evidence for? What are you trying to produce this research for? From the research side, it may be to further knowledge in that area. But for organisations like Evolve, there's generally a commercial reason behind this, or a growth scaling reason behind this as well. And there may be a mismatch here. What the organisation or the school wants may not necessarily be the same as what the researcher wants. So, for example, things are changing now, especially with the EEF and their website, not just talking about the effectiveness, but also the value for money and the effect size itself. But often when you're selling to schools, they're just interested in whether or not the evidence that you have passes the sniff test. So, for example, going back a number of years, and I used to meet with head teachers on a daily basis, trying to introduce them to our program. The question I would always get asked is, do you have any evidence for this work? And my answer was often yes. Very rarely did anybody question or follow up or ask any probing questions about the quality of the evidence, what was the evidence about. Things are changing now, and things have changed. And on some occasions, we're forwarding on our research papers and some of the evidence from previous studies. But from a school leader's perspective, it just needs to pass their sniff test. And their sniff test is generally, was it children of a similar age to ours, in a similar location to ours? But really what they're most interested in is, who are you working with? If you're working with a colleague of theirs around the corner, that's enough for them. So that's what we need as an organisation if we're growing organically, school by school. But when we started this Healthy Brains project, we were talking to a local authority. We were hoping to get funding and growth support from a local authority that would really help us to scale at a faster rate than we were scaling previously. And for that, they wanted an RCT. Now, as the project start date got closer, we realised that the local authority was no longer interested in the research that we were going to produce, whether it was good, bad or indifferent, because key personnel had moved on. And because of that, we should have been a little bit more nimble, and we should have flexed the programme to make it more suited to our current needs. So for example, we were working with 1,000 pupils, and that was something that was recommended to us by the evaluation organisation, and that would meet the local authority's sniff test. But from a head teacher's perspective, they didn't care. So we added lots of complexity and lots of different moving parts that possibly weren't needed. So on reflection, we should have adapted the programme as soon as the local authority had stepped back. We still had the funding in place, but the funder, they didn't care in terms of size or scale. They were happy for us to run the project as we saw fit. And there are lots of really high quality research papers out there that are working with, 100 students, 500 students. We were slightly over ambitious, and we had time to change our plans before it even started. So in hindsight, we made a mistake here with not passing our own sniff test. So hopefully our runways will be active again soon. But what I'm referring to here is the time between finalising the research design and starting the project. And it also links to the first point, lesson 1, about keeping track of key personnel who are involved in projects. Now, goalposts move, and goalposts move on a daily basis in schools. And this point is all about balancing the flexibility that you need to provide when you're working in the education setting, but also to make sure that you give yourself enough planning time to run an effective project. Now, I think we were guilty of being too organised, and we put our plans together way in advance. We were probably 9 months out from the start of the project when, working with the evaluation partner, we'd finalised the research design, and we were both happy with that. And the unfortunate thing is that we lost contact with one another during that 9-month period. So our runway was very inactive. Yes, in hindsight, we could have checked in with them on a monthly basis. They could have done the same with us. But lots happened in that 9-month period. So I would suggest as a researcher that once you've created the design, there's then a really important piece of work that's involved, just keeping in touch with the provider, whether it's a school, whether it's an organisation like Evolve. Those checkpoints are really important, and they're needed to ensure that all of the key stakeholders and all of the project assets are still in place. Now, it could be more challenging if there's a third-party funder that's got their own demands, but a lot can happen in that period. And I think it's important that the communication is strong, communication is regular, and it's a shame that all of the work that could be spent on a really sophisticated and well thought out research design is lost if it doesn't match up with the assets and the project as it may have changed from the moment in time when that research design was finalised. If you've got a Gantt chart or any other project planning system or tool, I think communication and regular check-ins with your delivery partner, that's got to be on there. You've got to have lines for that communication. And I think on reflection as well, it may not be skills that you necessarily thought would be the biggest critical factor in running a high quality project. Maybe your statistical analysis I referred to earlier, maybe the key factor that's in your mind, but I think it's the relationship building, stakeholder management, almost acting like a management consultant in the process, because this is what will lead to high quality research. And my final point here, it's not just about mutual benefit, but what I've called mutual and equal benefit. So we worked with, and we always work with evaluation partners who have an area of interest that overlaps with ours. So if it's in their portfolio or it's a topic that they've looked at before. Now, that's fine, but I think that doesn't really, that wouldn't really have gone far enough for us in our previous conversations when we're setting up this research project. And the reason I say that is because we were very much a small fish in a big pond. And a better question for me to have asked at the beginning is, what do you hope to achieve from this project? And what will it do for you and your organisation? They knew what the answers were. If we were from us, they knew what our answers to those two questions were, but we didn't know what their answers were. And in hindsight, which is a wonderful thing, maybe we would have found a different partner that was more geared up to working with smaller organisations, because they would have got a smaller research or evaluation organisation would have got closer to the benefit that we were getting. So there were times in the project where there was tension, and every good project should have some tension. So they were demanding of certain data or information, and at times we were demanding of certain information as well. But when there's equal benefit to be had, it's easy to overcome those tensions. It's about the amount of skin you've got in the game, and the fit is really important. So I think that it's really important that you don't just take a project because it's something that might excite you. It's got a really good match. There's lots of things that will add to your resume, when ultimately it means way more to you than it does to the provider, because you'll be trying to push water uphill with a rake if they're not as committed to it as you are. So I think mutual benefit's important, but just make sure you've got enough equal benefit, because otherwise there'll be tension further down the line. So that's it. They're the 6 key findings from the Healthy Brain Study, and I'm looking forward to taking this learning into an upcoming project we're doing with Professor Thomas at the Centre for Educational Neuroscience and Birkbeck, and it's hopefully going to right some wrongs. Hopefully we'll be able to go further than how far we went before. I'm certainly not under any illusion that will be the last evaluation we'll ever be involved in, because what I have found over the recent years is that as soon as you complete one piece of research, you end up with more questions than you started with. But this checklist is something that I'll certainly be using as we continue on our evaluation journey. And hopefully there are some lessons in here that may be useful for you if you're either at the start of your research career, or it could have reinforced some of the challenges that you may have faced previously. But I don't think anything that's in here is too complex or challenging. It's just having it in your consciousness and your awareness when you're engaging with people like myself and organisations like Evolve, to make sure that you do really deliver those high quality pieces of evidence. So I think, Joe, that's it from me, unless there are any questions.
Well, thank you, John. Yes, there are already some questions appearing. So there's one from Derek Bell asking, to what extent did you explore what schools wanted out of the research project?
That's a really, really good question. What was interesting is that the schools that were involved in the project weren't our first choice schools. So we thought that we would get schools that were able to absorb this extra work, whether it's because they had somebody who was passionate on their leadership team and would get behind it. But some of the lessons that are relevant here for researchers working with providers were also relevant for providers working with schools. So we might have tried to work with certain schools because the resources were there, but those resources moved in that 9-month runway period. So I think it's a really good question about asking schools and inviting schools to be a part of this. We did ask the schools, when we talked about the research design, we did say to them, what is it that you're hoping to achieve from this? And if this is successful, is it something that you could see rolling out on a more sustained basis? Because there's a commercial angle for us, which is why we were really interested in working with schools that would be interested in the results. But I think there was definitely a challenge around the active runway, because we were having those conversations probably 12 months before the intervention actually started. And a lot of the schools that signed up early didn't end up starting the project because of a change of leadership. So again, very difficult to try and control all of those variables.
Yeah. Complex interventions are always complex, aren't they? And another question from Sonia is, thank you for the lessons, sharing the lessons learned. I wonder whether you've thought about or actually done research teacher partnerships or research teacher education institution partnerships that might get more ownerships from teachers and trainers. And I think you've just answered that one. Sorry, it's always difficult for me to listen and read at the same time. So I think that question was answered in a certain, in a way that indeed. Graham Morgan is asking, why do you think so many people in education cling to existing practices that do not work well, rather than trying innovative approaches that may bring better results? Do you have any insight into that?
I think it's just easier to do what you know. So, for example, the whole concept of children coming out of the classroom for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, it just seems alien. It seemed alien to teachers back in 2018-19, because, especially in the morning, because that's when they do English and maths. And we found that schools are more receptive in the afternoon, after lunch. But now, when you've had children out of school for 9 months, remote learning from home, the concept of 30 minutes a day on a computer with us is not such a big issue after all. So I think it's routine. There's another report that we recently received. Again, it was Leeds Beckett University, and they were looking at some work that we're doing in Southwark schools, and it was linked to a physical activity project. And one of the key findings there about the difference in effect size between the schools is how much the school leadership had bought into it. And the 3 schools where the project was running more effectively, it was because the school had really embraced the intervention. And I think that knowing the head teachers closely, from having met them and gotten the project off the ground, they're the 3 head teachers who I would say are more innovative, forward-thinking, forward-looking. And I think that does make such a difference when you're looking to introduce any new concept into a school setting.
Yeah, really helpful. There is a comment here from an ex-health mentor, who was very interested to hear what was happening with Evolve. But Amy was wondering, in terms of the research projects, how were the parents briefed on this research, and did they receive or have access to the results? And maybe as a follow-up question from that is, how much does it matter that parents, are engaged in these interventions in the school?
There's quite a lot in there. Hi, Amy. I hope you're well. So I know you're still awake. So I think from a parent point of view, it's quite interesting. There are a couple of, I'll try and answer that from a couple of different angles. One of the issues that we faced was around the use of Brain HQ. Because Brain HQ has got a wealth of evidence from a health perspective, and GDPR regulations were sort of coming in at the time, and it was on the back of that when we're trying to get all of the necessary sign-offs from a school. A lot of head teachers took the decision that they didn't want the parents briefed. And the reason they say that is because if it was a maths application, they don't need to get parental sign-off to use a maths website. But if you position it as a health intervention, maybe they do. So I think all but one of the schools were very insistent that you don't need to get specific parental consent to use the app, but to be involved in the research project, that was down to Symmetrica and some of the consent letters they sent out. So there was an interesting dynamic at play there linked to GDPR and whether it was a health or an educational intervention. But independently, these schools didn't, I'm trying to think of the locations. I don't think any of the head teachers spoke independently about this. It was just, they all came up with a similar conclusion. No, we're doing this for educational reasons. It's an educational app. So we don't need consent for the child to use this, but as part of the research project and the ethical approval, that was a different form of consent. We are now working with Professor Thomas, and we interviewed yesterday for a PhD student who we're looking forward to working with. And the next project is in a local authority, and it's been set up quite differently. So we have the local authority that will be recruiting schools, and the method that they're going to adopt is to make it a competition. So rather than us going knocking on doors, the local authority will invite schools to be a part of this, and they have to put a proposal forward as to how they're going to make it a success. And this is a really nice way of doing it. And they have to pay as well. It's not as though the schools are getting this for free, that they still have to make a financial contribution. And one of the questions that we're going to ask in here is about parental engagement. And this is something that we really find, or we're finding more now as part of our work. It's not just about the impact we have on children during the school day. It's the influence that we can have when they go home as well. And part of that has come from COVID and the fact that a lot of health mentors now are doing virtual mentoring sessions and getting to know parents and having those conversations. But Brain HQ and any educational health intervention that can be delivered remotely, it's going to be in the home. Parents are going to see children using it, and we're encouraging children to use the app, which many of the children we're working with don't have a phone, so they'll be using their parents' app. So even in the last 2 years since the Healthy Brain study, we realised that there's a necessity now that parents are closer to the project. So I'm not sure, Amy, if that's of use, but there's definitely more involvement for parents in future studies, definitely.
Well, it definitely was interesting to hear that from my point of view as well, to, in terms of parents being involved in it. Amdauker is wondering to what extent these projects helped or are helped or hindered by pressures from government and policymakers, and priorities set by government at any given time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big question. So the organisation itself grew very significantly back probably around 2010, 2012. And there were a couple of spikes in growth. The first one was linked to pupil premium when that was introduced into schools. And schools were desperate for health mentor support. And we got to over 100 schools at one stage, and we couldn't recruit and train enough health mentors. And another spike came when the government introduced money for transitional courses between primary and secondary in the summer holidays. So definitely the intervention benefits from policy, but I'm echoing some of the words that Michael always says to me. I probably got the years wrong, maybe 20 years ago, the concept of going to a gym, a physical gym, like to exercise, was unheard of. You'd only go to a gym if you were playing competitive sports and you needed to do exercise because it had a performance element to it. Now we all go to gyms. I don't think anyone's going to gyms at the moment because they're shut, but we do it for health reasons. And Michael's saying in 10 years' time, he's saying he probably won't be around to see it, but people will be going to brain gyms. People will be working out on technology that works, and it'll be something that's mainstream. And that will probably happen with or without government intervention. So we do have a lot of interest from various different levels in terms of the work that we're doing, especially relating to Brain HQ because it has such a strong evidence base in other settings. But I would suggest in the education sector, in terms of programs like this and projects, education is a small world, and things tend to happen organically. If a school starts seeing results, it will get shared. If it gets shared from one school to the next, it will quickly share. And I've seen it happen with other providers who are now almost the de facto organisation for creative writing, the de facto organisation for a different intervention in schools. So I think that the government is probably still playing catch up when it comes to pedagogical interventions in schools, but when it comes to policy and funding, there are other elements involved. And one of the challenges that we're facing is that a holistic solution like the Health Mentor and using a solution like Brain HQ, which doesn't just focus on mental health, it focuses on attention, it focuses on processing speed, executive function, learning. It's got so many benefits. No one single government department will want to get behind and push it because they'll see it's somebody else's responsibility. So this is why the David and Goliath example is relevant, because generally you've got the Goliaths who align themselves with various funding streams, but it's the Davids who are out there who are quite nimble, trying to come up with authentic solutions that work. And a lot of those solutions aren't associated with direct funding or revenue streams. So I think there's more work that could be done, but we've certainly not been guilty of waiting for the government to make certain decisions. We've just gone and found a way, and the entrepreneurial element of our work has remained strong throughout the last 15 years.
It's great to hear, John. I mean, we're getting close to finishing time. I think Erica makes a comment in the chats that, you know, it's around teachers getting and need to be supported not only by senior leadership, but probably also by researchers, project managers, so that they know where they can go to if they've got questions. And senior leadership probably needs help from a resource point of view with funding to, you know, allocate time to projects, etc. So there's lots there.
I think just very briefly, Joe, on that, there's an interesting example because evidence is great and what's on the EF website is great, but it's the how. Teachers often say, well, that's great, but how do I do it? Yeah. And seeing it in practice is the key thing. And I think that's a nice way to wrap things up, because our health mentors are doing some great work, but we don't see that as our only solution. We're now training school staff to become health mentors because they've seen the how. They've seen how a health mentor delivers the intervention. And if they get the training, they can just role model and they can follow their lead. So I think that's an important question. It's how do they bring that research to life?
I think that's very good advice, John, to finish off with. And thank you very much again for your talk today, for sharing those lessons learned. They definitely reminded me of some things that, you know, good to bring them to the forefront again. Yeah, so thank you all very much for those of you who've listened to today's presentation. I very much look forward to seeing you all again next week, and take care for now. Goodbye for me.